So this paper which we have presented is basically on the National Price Protection Act of the NPPA, in which certain drugs have been price regulated by the government of India. And we have tried to see what the annual cost savings have been to the patients because of this price regulation of these anti-cancer drugs. So India is a very diverse country. India's healthcare is very diverse too. We have a public health system and we also have a private health system. Presently, most healthcare is actually around 60% of the healthcare is probably serviced by the private health system. With that, I mean that more than 60% or approximately 60% of the patients avail their health facilities at the private centers. Most of the public centers are free, and there are a lot of schemes offered by the government, which are at the state level and which are at the central level, which is basically an inclusive insurance scheme, uh, usually up to the tune of rupees 5 lakh Indian rupees for a year per family. But when it comes to cancer, the expenses are pretty high. And the expenses are not only for the surgery or the radiation or the chemotherapy, but the expenses also run into because of the investigations, the distance patients travel from their village or from their town to the hospital, the stay, because cancer treatments are prolonged treatments. So once we talk about, and when we talk about expenditure in cancer, it's not only about the treatment, it's also about multiple other social factors which we have to take into play. And all this adds to the burden of expenditure. One important thing, the private insurance in the country is pretty limited. The insurance coverage in the country is hardly 10 to 15%. Most people, most patients pay for their treatments out of their pocket. So the out of pocket expenditure is pretty high. And in some cases, the catastrophic expenditure, which is more than 10-20% of the annual savings, is very high. So because of all these factors, there is a mix that there is a elite which is able to pay for their cancer treatment. There's a large middle class which is burdened because of cancer payments. And there is also a large population which is below the poverty line or just above the poverty line, which gets pushed because of out-of-pocket expenditure and catastrophic expenditure. And lastly, most of the out-of-pocket expenditure, almost 70% of this goes into buying anti-cancer drugs. That's why this regulation by the government trying to cap the prices of the anti-cancer drugs has dramatically reduced the prices by close to 40 to 80%. And this would hopefully limit the out-of-pocket expenditure for patients, caregivers, and their families. To understand at what we have looked at, we just need to go back a little and see how the market in India was regulated, or the anti-cancer drug market in India was regulated. Earlier, so basically all drugs are sold at an MRP, or a maximum retail price, which is not fixed by the government, but it is fixed by the uh, pharma people. So each drug has its own MRP. So the government earlier pooled most of the drugs which were commonly available in the market, or which had a market presence of more than 1%, and took the average and put a ceiling, as that would be the ceiling MRP. But what we also know is that most pharma companies, including generics, so there was a thought earlier that you get into generics and biosimilars, the costs come down significantly. But that's not the case in many anti-cancer drugs. The generic pharma companies still had a very high MRP, and thus patients used to shell out a lot of money even for a generic molecule or a biosimilar molecule. So the background for this study is the NPPA Act has put a ceiling price. Now, what is a ceiling price? At whatever price the stockist receives the drug, he cannot charge more than 30% of the drug to the hospital or to a patient. So the end user, that is a patient, pays only 30% plus the stockist price. In that way, as I just told you, the prices have come down significantly. So what did we look at? There are 42 drugs which have been included or scheduled drugs in this NPPA. So we looked at each of those 42 drugs. We looked at each molecule. We looked at all the brands, the original innovator and the generics which were available in the Indian market. We looked at all the strengths and dosages which were available. We looked at the pre-NPPA pricing of each of these brands, and we looked at post-NPPA pricing. We calculated the difference in both INR and USD. We calculated the savings for a patient per cycle, and we also extrapolated it and calculated it for a fixed number of cycles, like 6 cycles or probably 1 year of treatment. Thus, what we have tried to look at is how has the NPPA price cut regulation helped patients, and we have tried to look at the savings to these patients for these 42 drugs. We have looked at all these 42 drugs, and the most important or the large price cuts have been seen with some of the most commonly used drugs like pemetrexed, which is used in non-small cell lung cancer, erlotinib, which is used in lung cancer, regulated growth factors, fulvestrant, everolimus. These are all some of the drugs which have seen enormous price cuts. Pemetrexed has been a huge game changer. Lung cancer is extremely common in this country. Pemetrexed is very, very commonly used, and the prices have been slashed by close to 87% for some brands. So that has been a big game changer. Erlotinib, an orally prescribed molecule which is available at much cheaper cost compared to earlier, and it is still available much lesser than the MRP if you directly purchase it from the stockist. Like growth factor in the supportive care portfolio. So that has received a big price cut. But some of the drugs which have not received such a big price cut post NPPA has been bevacizumab, some brands of fulvestrant, everolimus, etc. So while most drugs have received a decent fall in their prices, there still remains to be solved that some drugs like bevacizumab, which are used in multiple indications, which have uh, marginal benefit of maybe 2-3 months, and which are used continuously, have to receive a larger price cut probably so that it's accessible to most patients. Lastly, most immunotherapy molecules, most patented molecules, because the patent is valid for 5 years, none of them have been a part of the NPPA. So since immunotherapy is the order of the day where it's the first line in most indications, many patients literally cannot access the standard of care like immunotherapy in most diseases like be it melanoma, head and neck malignancies, lung malignancies, renal cancer, etc. So that is one area of concern. Yeah, so that's a policy decision by the government. Obviously, as ordinary citizens, we cannot comment on it. But yes, there is a hope, and there has also been a talk that more drugs would be probably there in the ambit. Some of the common drugs like trastuzumab, rituximab. Uh, there has also been a talk of probable compulsory licensing for a few drugs so that the prices can come down. So it's a hope that the more the number of drugs under the price radar, the more access patients would have, the larger volumes of patients who would benefit, and better quality of life, and ultimately transforming into better cancer care. Okay, so this is an extension of what we discussed some time back. So patients either pay from their pocket in this country, or that could be in the form of a privately taken health insurance. Some people do have an employer health scheme, which is usually partially funded by the government and the employer and the employee. So that takes care of most costs. The Pradhan Mantri, the Pradhan Mantri Health Scheme, or the Pradhan Mantri Bima Ayojana, or the central government sponsored health insurance scheme covers roughly 40% to 60% of the population today for a family of up to 5 people for 5 lakhs a year. Similarly, there are a lot of state-sponsored schemes like Arogyashri from the state which I come, that is Telangana, in the southern part of the country, where close to 85% of the population is covered, and majority of these people are the below poverty line people. So yes, the aim of the state is to have an inclusive health scheme where most patients would be covered. And yes, there are a set of people who obviously pay for their own treatment with the conventional health insurance, paying premiums on their own. So the aim in the longer run would be that it would be a free market economy. At the same time, the health would be an important subject. There will be more GDP spending on health and more state involvement or the central government's involvement in taking care of the health of the vulnerable populations. One thing which I would like to add is the NPPA is one part of the whole story. The whole issue here is about cancer drugs, their affordability, accessibility, patients and their families' ability to sustain cancer treatment for prolonged periods, considering that these drugs are pretty expensive. Now, if we take immunotherapies, for example, an average immunotherapy cycle with best support, even in a country like India, where the prices are much cheaper compared to the West, would still be $3,000 per cycle, which is unimaginable, which 90% of the population cannot afford. If this is the case with in India, which is the fifth largest economy or the sixth largest economy of the world, there are a lot of people, a lot of cancer patients. Most cancer patients belong to the low middle income group countries, LMIC countries, 60 to 70% of patients, they cannot access standard of care. So the question is not about just about NPPA. The question is, we need better drugs, we need generics, we need biosimilars, we need competitiveness, we need competitive pricing, we probably need NGOs to pitch in, we probably need bulk purchases like done by the NHS in UK. We need scientific know-how in the form of probably reduced weight-based dosing, like done for immunotherapy, like pembrolizumab, nivolumab, so that the doses come down, and that in turn spills over that you spend less for buying a particular dose. We have seen that with molecules like serotonin, abiraterone, where we take the pill burden is less, and you end up paying less. So we need a mix of scientific research. We need a mix of government policy, a strong government backing. We need participation from industry. We need more generics. All this put together so that prices, cancer drugs are affordable, accessible, and thus most people in most countries, including the vulnerable populations, should be able to benefit, so that cancer treatment doesn't remain only for the elite few, but it's accessible for most people.